Yep, there we go. So good evening, everybody. This is probably going to be the last Sunday night COVID chat that I'm going to do for a while. But very fortunate tonight to have a special guest with us, Professor and Dr. Erin Bromage from UMass Dartmouth, who is an associate professor of infectious disease and host immune response of animals. He's been featured just about everywhere, including CNN, New York Times, and his blog, COVID-19 Musings, has been viewed by over millions of people. So we're very fortunate to have him today, and I know that several people over the last couple of weeks have been asking about it, and we were able to make it happen this week. And Professor Bromage, thank you for joining us.
No problem at all. I'm really glad to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, you. I know that you're in the process of actually finishing something else today that it'll hopefully be published in the next couple of days. Is that right?
Yeah, just putting an op-ed piece in CNN for tomorrow. I'm going to be writing regularly for them now, just to put things in perspective from where are we now, but sort of risk mitigation, what things we can and should be doing depending on what it looks like where we live.
Yeah, and I think that's right, because I think that things look differently in different parts of the country. And you chatted a little bit about, how numbers can look differently. And I think part of what you're going to be talking about will be how the numbers in various states are kind of up in the air, and people are looking at different states right now with discussion about how some states are having more cases right now, right?
Yeah, so we're seeing, you hear in the news that there's 17 or 19 states that all have increasing cases. And that seems worrisome, but almost half of those states, the increase in new cases is coming from increased testing. The more you test, the more cases you find. And that doesn't mean that the outbreak is actually expanding in those states. It just means the state has stepped up and starting to do their job a little bit better, testing more, finding more, and every extra person we pull out of circulation that's infected, that's one less transmission chain that we have. Yeah. So we shouldn't be jumping all over the states that are actually having increasing numbers because of increasing testing. The ones that we really need to focus on are the ones whose testing is staying flat or increasing a little bit, but the number of positives that they're getting per test is increasing. So when we look at Texas, when we look at Arizona, California, even Washington, they're all increasing, and it's not because of increased testing. There is something going on there.
Yeah, and that's the thing to sort out, absolutely, so that it's not just extra testing. I just, again, I said before we came on, I usually update everybody what's happening in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, we have 105,603 total cases. Total new cases today reported is 208. Usually on the weekend, we actually see that the numbers, we've had instances where we can't really count on Sundays for trends sometimes, but 208 cases, 48 new deaths to bring our total up to 7,624 deaths. Again, unfortunately, a disproportionate number of those patients that have died are from long-term care facilities at 4,803. The weekly update in New Bedford was that there were 1,991 cases as of June 10th, and there have been slightly over 80 deaths in the city. Greater New Bedford, Acushnet has to date 87 cases, Dartmouth 373, Fairhaven 236, and Fall River 89. The status at the hospital right now, there are 38 patients at St. Luke's Hospital that either have COVID or presumed COVID, with 7 in the ICU. And those numbers have really, over the last several weeks, trended down. We were in double digits for quite a while, but those numbers actually are starting to look better. The cases over in Fall River at Charlton, there are 55 patients at Charlton right now that have COVID and 13 in their ICUs. And they, for whatever reason, Fall River did seem to have a slight uptick recently in the number of cases at their hospital. But anyway, overall, that's the status of what New Bedford and Massachusetts is looking like right now. And so we've had some some opportunities to see that things have gotten better, certainly in our own community and certainly in the state, as we've moved into phase 2. And again, phase 2 has been kind of a real stress test, I think, for communities, especially coupled with, again, the protests and some of the decrease in physical distancing and mask use, et cetera. So, we've all been kind of crossing our fingers in the medical profession over the last couple of weeks as we've seen these increased gatherings. Do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, so far, we haven't seen anything. And, usually it takes a while before we start to see a trend. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's almost no doubt that with the protests, there's going to be enhanced community spread. But we're not going to see that for at least 2 weeks, possibly 4. Generally because, let's just say we go out, people get infected there. 1 or 2 extra people locally, it's just going to be a blip in amongst the data that's bouncing up and down locally. And even nationally, if we got 3,000 or 4,000 new cases out of all the protests around the country in the 25,000 new cases a day we're having, you wouldn't really notice that because of the sawtooth pattern of the data that comes in. Where we will know is when those 3,000 people go home and they infect their household or their workplace, and that 3,000 becomes 10,000 or 15,000, that's when we start to see it. So while the protests themselves have certainly got my attention, we're not going to see this for another couple of weeks, and it may just be masked in the general increase that we've got because of people moving around,
right?
Just more with each new phase.
Right. Yeah, it was interesting in New Bedford, actually. One of the things that they've done for mitigation strategy is actually, so they just finished handing out masks to every ward. So every Saturday and Sunday for the last 3 weekends, they've been giving free masks to anybody. And actually, they've actually been giving masks out during the protests. So the mayor has actually, has attended a few of those and made sure that people are doing that. So I think that New Bedford's the only city in the entire country that's given masks to, or at least given that opportunity to everybody. And they did that through the Red Cross and Joseph Abood. I thought that was quite the initiative that they made, for a city. Yeah,
that's awesome that they did that, because as much as, I hate wearing a mask. You may be a little bit more used to it than I am, but the data just keeps streaming in. That mask use really as a source control is really important for lowering transmission chances. It just keeps, every day there's a new data comes out to just suggest this. And it's not a one-shot wonder, but it's going to go a long way to helping us regain more of what we've lost just through wearing an extra piece of clothing.
Yep.
So,
yeah, I think that it was, in healthcare, it was very frustrating for me to see at the beginning, where we had the mixed message coming from, the Surgeon General, where he's tweeting and saying, don't wear a mask. And, I think that unfortunately, because the whole issue was both an issue surrounding the science, but also supply and demand, because, for those of us in healthcare that are, going into COVID rooms, needing the N95 and some of the extra, the masks, the visors, the gowns, those are critical for us to, because just being in the front lines to prevent, contracting the virus. And, again, what I think that happened at the beginning is that, people were buying N95s and surgical masks, and, supplies were going down. And we really missed, I think, an opportunity that other countries at the beginning of this had implemented using masks. And I think that now we're finally gotten up to speed, but it took us a while to get there.
Yeah, and got to remember, at the start, we were trying to use the data, say, from another respiratory virus, influenza, to make decisions. And there are some pretty substantial differences between this virus and influenza. And wearing a mask for reducing influenza transmission has little to no effect. And I think that's a lot of where it started out from. Preserving the N95s, certainly. And I wish they would have just said that we needed it for frontline workers, because that certainly would have protected a lot of people in the community. But there was no way in the world that we could have everyone with an N95 when we didn't have that number of masks around. Yeah. And it was just, I guess, generally a shame that it's hard to say that we didn't need them at the start and now we do need them, and people don't understand how the science moved so quickly with this, because at first we were guessing, and over 3 months, which is incredible for science to move that fast, they went from guessing that it wouldn't help to actually showing that it did help, and then absolutely it does stop transmission. It really lowers it down by as much as 80 or 90%. That's where we are now, and the science says that now. Even World Health Organization just changed their tune with the new data coming out, and people sort of see that as flip-flopping, but that's science at work. Yeah. Science is the best data should lead, and that's what we've got. And so as our knowledge evolved, our opinion, our choices our decisions that we made need to evolve. And we are now at the point where we know masks work, but people are just like, well, I don't know. I heard a couple of months ago that they don't. So I'm glad I'm living in a state that while not everybody likes them, most people are on board with it and understand what it can actually do. Yeah.
Well, and, for people, the economics of it, when people want to move forward and move to the next level, they have to realize that has to be part of the strategy, whether they like it or not. In order for us to, to continue to take steps forward, masks are going to be very important. And, this is not going to be, we're not going to be able to prevent every case. And, unfortunately, I had a lot of friends. I have friends of mine that down in New York City, and one of my fellows that I trained with, she was down at Mount Sinai, and she unfortunately got really sick, in the front lines. And, I'm actually, we as a cardiology community had the opportunity to actually be able to converse for a few months, and we were able to learn a lot before, it kind of made its way up to Massachusetts. But, really hearing those stories in New York City were really, really amazing. And unfortunately, again, they struggled with having enough protective equipment. And I think that is really, an important thing, that we have to realize is that, the whole PPE campaign is not over yet, and that we need to still be vigilant, as we use mainly the cloth masks out in public, but we still need to make sure that we secure enough moving forward the surgical masks and the visors and the gowns and all and the N95s for healthcare, because, this, even though a lot of people felt like, June 1st rolls around and like, this is over. It's like, no, it's not. It's so not over. And we need to still be planning, for the next few months.
Well, I was in New York New York City on, what was it, Thursday. And, I've heard a lot of people saying, well, New York's got it under control. It's over and done. I was in Central Station, and I was one of maybe 5 people in all of Central Station. The reason it's under control there is anyone that was out on the street was wearing a mask. I mean, anybody that was on the street had a mask on. And then indoors, there was nobody. I've got this beautiful photo in my Facebook page of the single person that I saw in Grand Central, and I'm just like, wow. And so, in order for us to go back and be in our jobs and be side by side with people, in an office or something like that, masks are going to be part of the normal for quite a while. Our only other option is to find a way to retrofit our offices with better filtration, like hospital level filtration and air exchange. And, I know with my own work with UMass, there's no way we can do that or afford that. So we're going to have to work out a way to put in other measures to make it safer to actually be in those environments.
Yeah, you've made, and again, your post, your blog that went over several million, the risks, know them, avoid them. I think that one of the things that was really important that you made a point of was time and space. Those two things. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more as to how important those things are?
Yeah. So when I was writing this, I drew straight from my knowledge base that I work with in my lab. So we work with infectious disease in animals. And we were literally running challenge experiments. We still are right now, where we're taking a pathogen, exposing it to an animal and looking for whether the disease develops or not. And we know in our models when we're doing this that you can take a little bit of the pathogen and expose the animal to it for a long period of time and they will get sick. But you can also take a high dose of pathogen and expose it to them over a short period of time and they will also get sick. Yeah. So being infected is not just a single step. It can happen in multiple different ways. And so when we look at this from a human perspective, if I was face to face with you, which, normal distance would be 3 to 4 feet apart, having a conversation, every time you speak, especially with words with P's and T's, those hard words, you're puffing out little respiratory droplets straight out at me. And while I can't see them, they are there and they can land in my eyes. I can breathe them in my nose. I can breathe them in through my mouth. And that could be enough over a few minutes. Yeah. Just to get enough of a dose to be sick. You could cough, you could sneeze, and just that one event could be enough. But the more insidious one that we see is the one that leads to these super spreading events. So if it's just me and you have a conversation, I infect you or you infect me, the chain goes on. But with super spreading events, you get an infected person in an enclosed environment with 10, 20, 30, 40 other people around them. And the infected person is just breathing or talking or singing and releasing those droplets into the air. And every person in that room just breathes in a little bit with each breath. So you might get 10 and then another 10, and you've got to get to 1,000 before you get sick. Just picking numbers out there, but 10. And so if you walk out when you've got 500, you won't get sick. But if you stay in that room for long enough and you get to that 1,000, then that's an infectious dose. The infection can establish, and then now you are part of the problem. You've now been infected. So it can happen from a really brief encounter of a sneeze, a cough, a quick chat. It can be a 10-minute conversation with somebody, but it can also be spending an hour or two in a room with somebody who's infected. And rather than it's just you becoming infected, half of the people in that space will get sick. And we've seen that the super spreading events now that are documented totals into the hundreds, with literally tens of thousands of people infected.
Yeah. Yeah, it's impressive. The one I became most familiar was the one in Seattle with the choir in early March. But, even today I was looking up, there was several. There was a big event in Amsterdam. I think it was like over 100 out of 120 people, I think, that were, at a choir rehearsal.
The biggest one was the one in South Korea where it was a mega church. I think there's 20 or 30,000 people at that church. And this person, the index case, came to church, and from her coming to church that day and singing, being there, it led to 4,800 infections. Yeah. Not all at the one time, but she infected the group around her, who then infected the group around them. And so over a period of about 2 weeks, we ended up with 4,800 infections. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that it also brings up, the concept of ventilation in indoors versus outdoors, right? There's obviously significant differences, depending on closed space versus open space. I was a little surprised that the first wave of churches in Massachusetts was not, a lot more emphasis on doing maybe an outdoor service, et cetera. I mean, obviously the rain or weather could be a problem, but we kind of went back to church, so to speak, and I was a little concerned as to how that was going to happen. And some churches actually, I know the Episcopalian churches actually decided not to open yet, and they're still kind of watching. So it's an interesting concept.
Yeah, well, I think it was about 2 weeks ago. I was on a meeting with the mayor of Boston and his group. We were talking to, it ended up being over 100 houses of worship were there. And I think the vast majority of them decided not to open their physical physical presence. They just still did it remotely. I mean, they definitely didn't close because they were still doing funerals and doing those things. They just decided not to do in-person services. So a lot of places did. They chose a different path. And even, one of the local churches down the road from me here, I see them every Sunday. They set it up. It looks like a rock concert outside with the minister standing at the podium outdoors with speakers. Everyone is next to their car in the car park. I think that's brilliant. I think that is getting the people together, giving them the contact that they almost really want. They do want close. They want the hugs. They want the handshake, but they're not doing that. But it allows them to feel the community again. And I think that is a really smart way to address a pandemic and still allow people to worship in a safe fashion. Yeah, absolutely. I think that this has caused a lot of people to be more creative about how to do this. And again, it's not zero risk. It's how do you reduce the risk? Yeah. I saw you had posted something the other day about your haircut. I got one the other day as well. But it's interesting. Nothing is easy or nothing is simple anymore, right? Right. And so I think it took a little bit of arm bending by our stylist to be able to want to do this. And she'd done some family members in the past. And I think she was more worried about us than we, it wasn't her own concern. And, I just said to her, hey, it's not 4 people's hair you're cutting. It's not 4 times the risk because we're one pod. Right. So we went as a whole family. So rather than risking 4 interactions that she had, it really was one because, my wife and kids, we're all one pod, one unit together. We did it outside. We wore masks. She had a respirator on. When they were cutting around the side, took the mask off and held it here so that they could cut down, nice and close. There is a way to do it and do it safely. And it's still a little bit concerning to me to think about doing it inside. And I probably would, given if there was enough space there and they were only, then they were really restricting capacity. But everything's a calculation. You've got to look at what's happening locally and realizing, okay, if we've got, I'm looking at the numbers, 2% positive at this stage. If I get 100 people together, on average, 2 of those are going to be infected. So if I'm in a group of 5, the probability is really low. Right. And I'm doing those sort of mental calculations all the time about where I'm going and how many contacts I'll have. And it's becoming quite normal now, but it's, something that we're going to have to get used to, which is just tuning our radar for what's going on and adjusting our behavior accordingly. Right. Yeah, my barber actually has done a pretty good job. That windows are wide open, and again, there's very. I was pretty much the only one in there at the time, and they've set it up where there's only 2 chairs, and it's not. So I felt pretty comfortable, and again, and they were making sure that they were doing all the right things as well, because again, I had a nice chat with them just to kind of remind them, it's important that, making sure that they're safe and that they had enough, equipment, et cetera, and they felt comfortable. So, it was. Well, that's it. That's a big thing for me is my guiding principle now locally is when I walk into a store, and it doesn't matter what it is, I look at the employees. And it doesn't matter if it's in Lowe's or Home Depot or in Lee's Supermarket or Stop and Shop. I look at the employees and I look at what they're wearing, how seriously they're taking it, and how their employer has looked after them. Like, do they have good splash guards up? Is there a lot of people wearing, chin masks? I was in one of the bigger box stores the other day, and I'm not too worried about my own health. I'm a pretty healthy guy. I'm out of the age demographic of this. It might be a rough a month or so, but the odds are. But I looked there and I went in there and I saw 3 or 4 of their people with chin masks on. One of them had it hanging off their ear as well. There was at least half a dozen customers in there with no masks on. And I just went, I'm not going to be part of the problem here. And so I just turned around, walked out, and went to a different store that sold exactly the same stuff, but their employees had what they needed to be safe, which is customers wearing masks and them wearing masks. Because, we just need to look at Walmart that happened up near Worcester with the 30 plus cases there. Texas this past week, 5 of their restaurants that opened are now closed for another 2 weeks because they had outbreaks inside their restaurants.
Yeah.
Why? Because they didn't have the PPE. They didn't have what they needed to be safe in their work environment. And that's my gauge now. I look at what is going on and realize that I don't need anything right now. It's, I go and get food. I can go to a different store and get it from there. I don't want to put either the people working there in danger or myself or my family. So I use my feet wherever I can.
Yeah. Now, have you done takeout so far, or have you done mainly just at home?
Yeah, I love the takeout side of things. It's a way of not feeling lazy, even though we used to do it a lot. I have very few concerns about takeout at all. I probably wouldn't be jumping in and buying a salad, just because if you really want to drop down risk, you need a little bit of heat. And so, we had a beautiful Mexican dinner last night, takeout here. We've done Cask and Pig, we've done 10 Cousins, we've done a whole bunch of places there that curbside pickup, and I know that they've done remarkably well. So we try to do it at least twice a week to try to help them as much as we can, and we like their food. Yeah,
and I think that's a way to support the local, the local communities and the local establishments. I think the challenge, again, and I have not yet, people are doing the outdoor seating right now. And I know that there's businesses that, that's the first thing that, and even businesses that typically don't have outdoor seating, using sidewalks and various things. So, again, I know that people are being very careful about, how it, and like you said, though, at these various businesses, it's whether the business buys into, the PPE plan and the spacing and the disinfecting, et cetera. It's, how stringent are those things. And I think that that's going to be an important gauge, I think, for people as they start to venture out a little bit more, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I've said this through all of my posts over the last 3 or 4 months. You have to address the biology to fix the economy. And so here we had Texas, we had those restaurants rushing in to fix the economy, but they didn't focus on the biology of transmission. And guess what? They're now closed for at least 2 weeks, probably longer, because if their employees are sick, we know it takes about a month to get the all clear. So you're not just going to come up and find staff that can manage the front of your house or the back of your house. Right. With a restaurant out of the air right now, it's quite tough. So any business needs to look at, first and foremost, protecting their employees. And if you protect the employees, then just by the nature of what you're doing, you're protecting the customers. But for me, it's all about the employees, because if I'm in a grocery store, I'm there for 45 minutes. If I am working in retail, I'm there for 4, 6, 8 hours. And just as we said at the start, it's a little bit that builds up over time. So maybe me being in there for 45 minutes doesn't get me infected, but someone that's in there for 8 hours, that may be long enough, even with masks on, like even with them wearing a mask, for them to get to it. So every little thing that we can do, extra hand washing, wearing masks, properly fitting masks, like actually having them on your face, they all make a big difference. And again, my thought process is not so much about me or my family. It really is about those people in that work environment that are good enough to be there, to be able to allow me to buy my food or get what I need. And really, especially a month ago, were really putting themselves in danger. That's my metric for being a good citizen and just being a good community citizen, is just making sure that, retail, anyone that's working is well looked after. And if they're not, I just leave. So I'm not an extra body adding to the problem. I've thought about complaining, but I've realized that people that don't really get it and don't want to get it will never have their mind changed. So it's just, do the bits that I can and, go it that way.
Yeah. Well, you're definitely doing your job, because I think you've been able to educate a lot of people. And I think one of the important things that I've always taken from, your blog posts and the articles and your interviews is that it's a practical way of how are we going to do this. And I think that, even when looking at the article you wrote for, Memorial Day, and as people are coming together, again, how do you decrease the risk when people are going to get together anyway? And, how do you try to do those things in such a way is really what the message has to be, and I think that, you've done a great job of that.
Well, we know from sex education campaigns and drug use campaigns that an abstinence only policy just doesn't work. And so if you go on an abstinence only policy, when someone finds themselves in a situation, they don't have the tools or resources to protect themselves. And it's the same type of thing with an infectious disease, that if we say, stay home, stay home, stay home, and that's the only message that we have, people will go, okay, and some get locked away in the house, but then others go out, and they go out without the toolkit they need to keep themselves safe. And so I've sort of taken the approach, and there's a few of us that are doing this, that's the harm reduction approach, that you're going to do it. We'd prefer you stay home, but if you are going to do it, here are some tools and strategies you've got so that you don't become a statistic. You don't end up coming across my desk in a case report because you decided to have a party with 30 people around and everyone got sick there. That's my approach to things, is harm reduction, stay home. But even in my own family, we're not staying home. We're just employing very smart rules about how we can not be part of the problem.
Yeah. And I think, for people out there that aren't affected either directly or indirectly by somebody, either friend or family member, they don't really understand. And for me, on the other side, there was a week that unfortunately, because I take care of cardiac patients, they're the ones that potentially have the highest risk for complications. And there was a week that I probably lost just about a patient a day, at the height of things for a while. And it wasn't because of their heart, it was because of the complications, and they just really, unfortunately, did very poorly with COVID. I've had younger people that, they had a really nasty, essentially they felt as bad as the worst flu they've ever had, but they did okay. And, I think one of the things that becomes a concern is people that will say, okay, well, the case fatality rate overall is only 0.4. And, and then you hear people say, well, why do we need a vaccine? Why do we need a treatment? And what they really don't understand is that case fatality rate, which is based on CDC modeling, does not tell the whole story. That's overall. It doesn't tell, as we know in Massachusetts, for example, the average age is 52. And most people that are 52 don't end up in the hospital. But the average age in the hospital is 68, and the average age of death is 81. So even if you get it and you give it to somebody, in your family that's older, you give it to your parent, they may end up in the hospital. If you give it to your grandparent, they may end up in the ICU. And, the case fatality rate after 65 goes up dramatically, where that number at the very least at the lower end of modeling looks at, for anybody just above over 65, but not breaking it down, is about 1.3%. So, it's trying to get people to realize, that you or I would probably be okay.
Yep.
And our kids, but it's still protecting your parents and grandparents.
Well, one of the great studies, as in the science was really good, that came out yesterday, I think it was, showed the age distribution of index cases that started new clusters in Japan. So Japan didn't close down. They kept going about things. They did the 3 Cs, the crowded spaces, confined conditions. They had a really good way of doing this without shutdown. But they tracked these clusters, these large expanses of infections that occurred. And more than half of them started from people that were 20 to 29 years old. So they started in that age group, And then exactly what you said, they then went from that age group who was very mobile, have lots of contacts. Those contacts then had contacts, and then it ended up hitting a sentinel population where you ended up with lots of morbidity and mortality, lots of people getting sick and dying. And so we're seeing that there is a really important role of 20 to, say 29, but let's 20 to 40-year-olds in this because of their mobility, the amount of contacts they have, and that they seem to have a much less severe sort of disease than most other people and go about daily business a bit longer, but they're the ones that are moving it around, and then it's hitting our nursing homes. The gym ones are amazing, like inside gymnasiums where that's sort of going there, hitting our processing, like the fish houses locally, the meat packing places throughout the country. I mean, we're up to 40,000 infected workers in meat houses. Nearly 700 of them have died. And these are young, fit people that are in conditions that are just perfect for the transmission and getting a high dose, which we have a pretty good idea that a high dose of the virus leads to pretty bad outcomes.
Yeah, and I think that's the case, and I think that's obviously one of the reasons too for ICU and ER doctors or anesthesiologists. Some of those people, are the ones that have become the sickest. Unfortunately, a friend of mine who was an ICU doctor ended up, out of commission for a month and pretty sick, never quite to the level of really needing hospitalization. But, nonetheless, it was certainly a real challenge. And I do think that there is something to the burden of disease. But, one of the cases, I think I saw numbers recently that said, though, still age of less than 65, 15% of the deaths, are less than 65. And, so that means that still younger people can still get this and become sick. And, in general, what we've seen, though, is those chronic diseases, obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, kidney disease, those that are immunosuppressed for various reasons are the ones that we do see that become the sickest, but that's not always the case. I think one of the first cases where they used ECMO at Mass General, patient was 49 and really healthy. And, got to that level of requiring support beyond just the ventilator and ICU and really needed that special extracorporeal membrane oxygenation in order to stay alive. And he was, knock on wood, one of the survivors, because when people typically get that sick, they don't do that well. But it's just a reminder, it is true, is that most people do fine that are younger. But we want to make sure that we take this seriously and continue to take this seriously, because we don't know, because there are some people that are well.
Yeah. And that's, for me, it's not about fear. It's about understanding it as much as we can. Yeah. We know the younger you are, the less severe disease that you have. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a role in this. And I really don't like the talk on just purely looking at fatalities, because they're bad. And I'm not saying anyone's life is worth less, but we know that there is a big age distribution. It primarily hits the old ones. But, we're sitting there looking at the very rare cases. I think we've got 128 kids under 10 that are currently in hospital. 40% of those children have no comorbidities. We don't know why they've gone to that level. And so it's a very small number, but you can sort of say, oh, if they all had diabetes, or if they're all obese, you can sort of go, okay, I know the population, we can isolate and protect them a little better. But when 40% of these kids have nothing, it makes you sit back and go, oh. And then the case just this past week of the 20-year-old female that's no comorbidities at all. She wasn't in Massachusetts, no comorbidities at all. And rather than letting her die, and she would have died almost anywhere else in the world, they did a double lung transplant on her. And looking at the lungs that were removed, I've never seen anything like that before, ever. in regards to the necrosis, the tissue death that was seen there. And so the thing that worries me, and again, it's probably rare, is we know the mortality, and we know it's not very risky for people under 50. But we also know that people under 50 do have it pretty rough. And we know that the lungs get beaten up pretty badly. And when we look at the data from SARS from 2003, some of those people that were infected with SARS took in the vicinity of 5 to 7 years to regain lung function. And so, I might sit back and say, hey, I'm going to recover from this, but do I want a 20-year-old that can't run anymore or has to wait 5 or 7 years before that they can still do that? And they're the type of things that we don't know. There was another paper coming out showing that people that are recovering from this, and again, young, in the months afterward, there's a really big increase in autoimmune diseases and allergies. So it may just be something that triggers and it disappears fairly quickly, but it also may trigger something more long-term. Again, it's not about fear. It's just we're 4 or 5 months into this, and we don't know. We know the short-term consequences are death for some people, but what are these longer-term consequences? And I think that's part of the reason why we are protecting schools and protecting workers and really trying to stop this going there, because death isn't the only measure. Quality of life, that if you can't enjoy a breath of fresh air because your lungs don't work, that's also important. You can talk about the cardiac issues that are there because I know it's working on the heart. I sit back and think, imagine a pathogen that takes away your sense of smell and your sense of taste. Think about where in your body that is working for that to happen. So now we know it's actually working somewhere inside your brain. And so what else could be happening? So again, it's not about fear, and I'm not trying to make people really stress out. It's just we don't know enough to confidently say, let this just run through the 20-year-olds and we're fine.
Right. Yeah, I think that I think that the strategy, for example, that people always look towards Sweden, for example, and say, how have they done? And I think that recently I've seen that they've kind of second guessed themselves a little bit in terms of their strategy, and time will tell. Their strategy was clearly not as aggressive in terms of the shutting down of various activities. And if you look at their data compared to certainly their surrounding countries, they didn't do as well with both the number of cases and mortality, and the idea of acquiring herd immunity. Their numbers were nowhere close to acquiring herd immunity, despite what they had for a case burden in Stockholm.
Yeah, nationally they're at 9%, and they've got to get up to 70%. So they're 1/7 of the way through this. And one of the things that people hold them on a pedestal in regards to the way in which they kept their economy open. They didn't close anything down mandatorily. But if you looked at movie theaters, we're running at 5 to 12% occupancy, restaurants at about 25% occupancy, not through government mandates, just because people didn't want to go out. So their economy tanked as well, because people were scared. They were able to move around a little bit more, but people weren't dining in restaurants at the same way. So there is very few places in the world who have stayed open without doing any big changes, and their economy came out on the other side without any scars. Australia and New Zealand, they locked down hard. My home, in Australia, when they locked down for their month, if you were outside your house for not one of they had like 12 or 13 reasons that you could be out there, there was an $11,000 fine.
Wow.
Right. So,
oh, yikes.
Yeah. So, one of the reasons was exercise. So you could be out going for a jog. When I was back there, because I got there just as they went in their quarantine, I was going out for a surf. That was exercise and was allowed. It just, you weren't allowed to go out and sit, in an open space talking to a friend unless you were on the way to a doctor or going to get groceries or things like that. So it was just, if there was a group of kids roaming around the streets, you better believe that they were getting into a little bit of trouble. But they locked down, and they locked down hard. And here they are on the other side of it now, having a beer in a pub. They did extraordinarily well getting it under control because everybody got on the same page. And I mean, both on a political level and at a societal level, got on the same page nationally and said, okay, let's just hammer this. And they hammered it hard. And, now they're down below 10 cases a day in the entire country. Yeah. They're testing 8,000 tests to find one positive. That's what they're doing. Massachusetts, we're doing 100 to find 2. And that's amazing by national standards. Arizona is at around 13% right now. It's just, we all have a part in this right now. And, it's up to us to really keep Massachusetts going and keep it open. And it's just, again, it's our choices that we make that will make a big difference here.
Yeah, someone in the comments had asked a question, and this is something that I'm on the board at the Boys or Girls Club in New Bedford. And, now we're starting to move into questions of what's going to happen for summer camp. And obviously the things that come up about what's going to happen in the fall with schools. Yeah. And, I think that these are not easy questions. I had somebody approach me about, how to, they had a summer basketball camp, and I gave them, and I actually sent it to a couple other colleagues, including an infectious disease specialist, and we all kind of kicked around about, and as a kid, even though I'm short, basketball was my thing, and I spent my entire summer running up and down a court, but unfortunately it was hard to justify being able to put kids into those situations because you can't physically distance, and it's not possible to be wearing a mask in certain such situations. So I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are. How old are your kids?
11 next week and 13.
Yeah.
So I don't fall in with the I'm sort of in the middle with the epidemiologist here that I will have my daughter at camp mid-July as long as the numbers still go the same way. And it's a leadership camp run in Dartmouth. It's being done outdoors. There's a pretty seems to be a well-described way to keep them distant and those type of things. I think the risks that are there of infection are outweighed by the benefits of what she will get out of that interaction and learning in that environment. I'm also I coach for one of the Dartmouth youth soccer teams. Starting tomorrow, we're allowed to start coaching again, and I will start coaching my teams, but it will be done in an infectious disease control way, which is part of what soccer has put together, but it's in groups of no more than 10. There's no scrimmages. You've got to keep them 6 feet apart. So it's developing drills that allow physical distancing while still giving them the physical activity and social interaction that I'm longing for, but kids are longing for as well. So I don't think it needs to be an all or nothing approach with this. I think it needs to be, if you've got children and they're going to camp or going to start sports up, you need to have a chat to where they're going, to their coach, to the organization, and say, what are you doing in order to not be part of the problem? Because we're not worried so much about what happens to the kids. We know the vast majority, the mortality rate is 0.005 for children. They don't get a severe disease. But we also know locally that we have a lot of homes that are multi-generational. And the last thing I want is for one of my players on my team to get sick at training, to bring it back into their home and infect grandma. I couldn't live with that type of thing. So I think having those conversations are a really important thing. Schools, I really hope they go back in fall. I hope parents understand the risk that there will be to do this, not necessarily to the kids, but to the teachers and the staff. We have to work out a way to protect them. I'm not really a fan, I know I fall off the spectrum here, a fan of having kids in classrooms with masks. I know that they work, but kids in a mask and touching it and touching surfaces, I think we're just transferring one risk to another. And so, I'm hoping that they take the approach of podding up classrooms. This is a pod. It's got X number of students in it and a teacher. We isolate them away from everywhere else. And that way we don't have to worry about it jumping between classrooms. But parents, if they do send their kids, are going to have to do this with the known risk that their kids are going to they could get sick. And we are seeing this. Israel opened their schools up 6 weeks ago. Their numbers are way, way lower than ours. They had an outbreak at their school of 113 kids at one of their schools. This week, another 6 schools closed. They have a threshold of 3 kids. If 3 kids in a school test positive, the school closes down. And so I believe it's up to 60 or 70 schools in Israel now have closed down over the last 3 weeks. And they have nowhere near the level of community transmission that we have currently. So it's going to be an interesting proposition. I believe private schools have got it maybe a little easier than public schools because their class sizes are already smaller. I honestly don't know how to do this. There's no way to do this in person and not have infections in schools. It's that risk that we're going to have to face. The thing I worry about is we start off in person, we get those infections. The teachers have done all this work to get a classroom together, and then we have to transition to online, and that's going to take 2, 3, 4 weeks to get that up. And now we have this big gap once again. So it's a really tough question to answer, and it's a tough decision to make. I really do hope it's in person, but there needs to be a lot of soul searching and a lot of funding needs to come to our schools for this to happen.
Somebody just brought up a question about, middle school and high schools, they move in class to class, and that's an obvious challenge as well.
Right. And it needs to change. It's when I talk about coming back to schools, I'm talking about the 4 to 14-year-olds. I think we can do that and know that we're not going to have large cluster outbreaks. We're going to have a room get sick, but probably not the whole school. When we look at high schools, they work just like colleges. And when it gets in, it just goes, Montreal, great example. Denmark, great example. So there are ways to do this in high schools that are a little bit different, that you may end up having a science day and that's what you do. Or you can't go from period to period to period, because every time we do that, it's a new teacher, it's a new group of students, and now all of a sudden the chains of connection of these infections it's just hard to do. So we're going to have to really think how to do this differently. Otherwise, we just all have to accept the risk that our children are going to come home infected, and it may bring it into our house. It's a really hard decision. If we had, again, unlimited money, there is a great group working up at Harvard called the Healthy Buildings Group, and they're talking like simple things. We know if you open a window of a classroom, open the windows, you can cut down transmission of influenza by about 50%. So if this virus holds true, if we had just that simple ability in all our classrooms, maybe we can lower it down and we don't have large outbreaks. But unless we can start investing good money in ventilation and air extraction and air exchange, then we have to rely on things that we physically wear and modifications in our behavior in order to try to stop transmission. And that just gets tough.
Right. Well, and probably also it affects, and this is one of the things that I've seen is that, there's some communities that are cutting physical education and music and certain things. And, there's certain classes that are going to be very, very difficult. I mean, in Dartmouth, Dartmouth's band is nationally recognized, and I'm not sure how that's going to work. For me,
but again, let's be creative with Dartmouth Band. Every time I've heard them, they're outdoors in a car park. We know outdoors is 20 times less risky than indoors. So I've seen them train, and I've seen them march around in their car park, and they're pretty well socially distanced. And we know with musical instruments that the only ones that are really worrisome from a transmission point of view are the flute, the piccolo, and the clarinet. The way in which the air blows over the mouthpiece aerosolizes things. So put them off into a corner a little further away. There are ways that you can do it. That this is not an all or nothing. It's just be creative in what we're doing. Talking to my kids' school, does science need to happen in a classroom? Get outside, use the outdoors as part of the classroom for what you're doing while the weather's good. Let's take advantage of what we know works for a transmission point of view or blocking it, and use that where we can. I really do want the kids in school. I'm seeing like universities and colleges opening. That we're going to have to get creative about what we do. I think you can probably control it at a university better than you can at a middle school or even a high school, because I think college students can get it a little bit better, and we have a little bit more control as professors over them. If they won't wear a mask, you just ask them to leave. They're adults. It's not like you're kicking them out and they're roaming the hallways. It's just get out. I do that with cell phones in my classroom. If they pick them up, I ask the students to leave. So I think, though, we're going to see it's a hybrid. The classes that need to be done in person, lab classes, some of the music classes, the pottery, the artwork, they're going to be done in person. And then I think we're going to find some sort of hybrid approach for everything else. Maybe half the people in the classroom with the other half at home. And then the next day when we meet, it flips around. Those that can't do it from home are always in the classroom. So I think we can get creative with how to do this and do it more safely.
Yeah, and like you said, it's going to take creativity, it's going to take planning, and it's going to take people to buy into it as well.
Yeah. I mean, I'm trying, like with my own university, I said, why don't we just work out what masks we think are appropriate for the students and have a part of their welcome package for the university. We give them 3 masks of an appropriate quality that are, labeled, that have, that on there. But we know now that they have a decent quality. I'm not talking N95. I'm just saying a good fitting, 2 or 3 layered cloth mask will go a long way to dropping transmission in classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think what you made a good point is the fitting. Even for people out there that have bought N95s, if they're not fit tested, I've been fit tested twice at this point because, again, I needed to wear a different size at some point when they ran through some of the other ones. And, getting fit tested is you got to make sure that there's no leak. And I will say wearing an N95 for several hours, it is a challenge. It's not like a cloth mask, and it's not like a surgical mask. And
I mean, when people hear fit testing, they don't understand that you've got it on, and if they're doing it properly, they put a huge hood over your head, and then they put something smelling in there. It can be salt, but it can be. I mean, what do they use for you?
I forget what scent it was, but there was. Yeah, it was.
And it's basically put that into the hood, and can you smell it? And it's like, if you can, you just failed the fit testing. And then it's like, I need you to talk now. And if you can talk and you smell it, you failed again. And these fit tests are quite extensive that you can't smell something through it. For me, it's not about N95s. We've found some really, saccharin, I'm seeing somebody put up there. We're finding there's some really good local manufacturers that are making some great cloth masks. We just got a whole new batch come through. We ordered a whole new batch from a local company. They made some summer ones because the ones that were made before were really quite hot on my face now. And she made these summer ones, and they're just beautiful. And I can feel every breath that I take as I breathe in, you can feel the mask come in. And so you know that most of what you're breathing is coming through the filter, coming through the material.
Yep.
And so there are things that you can do that can help dramatically.
Yeah, and you mentioned at the beginning, the masks are a big deal, and there was a concern. And as a cardiologist, I never thought I was going to write a mask article, but just at the time when the CDC came out, a few friends of mine, other doctors, had actually written an article, and masks. The concern was there was actually one really bad study that was done, I think 5 or 6 years ago, that they looked at cloth masks and they tried to say that the numbers actually increased people getting disease, and that's not true because it was not a controlled study. The control group actually was using masks, so it was I couldn't believe it even got published. So consistently, masks, in these settings are a good thing, are useful, and will cut down the transmission. And it's one of those things that if people are touching the mask, touching their face, moving it around, not washing it, yeah, there is concern. Yeah. And there was a concern too that people weren't going to socially distance because of it. I don't think that has been something I've seen. I actually find that if you're wearing a mask, people actually stay back a little further rather than getting closer to you a lot of times. That's been my experience.
Well, you're wearing your mask, people are buying into it in the first place. They're sort of getting it. There's an interesting question up there about air conditioning. It's probably a good one to address. That one of the problems we see about poorly filtered spaces is, think about your home and central air conditioning. You've got a filter in there, but you're not bringing new air from the outside, and it's being circulated around. In most buildings, so most commercial buildings, there is always air coming from the outside that they're bringing in and pushing through, which dissipates a lot of those droplets out. But some other restaurants where you see a window unit or a split system, the air is just being circulated around and around and around in there, and that's where it becomes a problem. One of the interesting things, you might have heard about seasonality of the virus, and people were sort of thinking that it would go away with summer, but we're not seeing that, especially in the southern states. It's because of air conditioning and the heat. We know that this virus at high humidity will drop out of the air faster. At low humidity, it stays in the air for longer. And so when you get into an air-conditioned space, we're extracting the moisture out of the air, and it usually drops it down to 25, 30, 40%, and that keeps it in the air for longer. And so what we're actually seeing in Texas and what we're seeing in Arizona and these southern states that are Alabama, for example, the outbreaks is they were outside a few months ago when the weather was fine. They're now indoors a lot more. And so what we've got is lower humidity indoors. We've got recycled, recirculated air, and now infections are actually ramping up there. Compare that to the Northeast. The Northeast, you're sitting outside today, and I had to throw a sweater on because I was feeling a little cool. We're not spending as much time inside now because of the weather. So it's actually had a little bit of a different effect on transmissibility because of air conditioning and how hot it's got, making it better. I'm not worried about infections in my home. My home is a safe zone. My car is a safe zone. I'm not worried about the air conditioner there at all. Where my anxiety, where I tune my attention is going into a retail store that doesn't have big cavernous ceilings, that doesn't have big ducted air conditioning. Those type of ones are the ones that I don't run out of. I just limit my time in. So, anyone that can have a door open, anyone that has big ducted air conditionings where you can actually see the duct work and the vents, that their system of air that they have in there is bringing air in from outside and pushing it through and pushing it out. And so there's no risk in there, but it's a lower risk than somebody that has a window unit in their store or a split system in their store. they're ones that you need to just be a little bit more cautious about how much time you spend in those places.
Yeah. Well, it's like you said, know the risk and try to limit that, right?
Yeah, it really is. It's just understand what this virus is and does, how it behaves, how it survives, and just tweak your behavior on this to try to limit your chances of being exposed. And the big one are those face-to-face conversations and indoors with lots of people for an extended period of time. They're the things you need to avoid. And if we do that, we bring the reproduction rate of the virus way down, and we can just cruise along for not forever, but we can cruise along with this until we find a good treatment or get to a vaccine.
Right. And it's still going to be a distance away from everything that I've seen. But yeah, absolutely. That's really good advice. Well, I think that's probably, we're a little bit past 8 o'clock, and probably going to wrap things up. But that was really a wonderful discussion, and really I look forward to your article that's going to come out this week. You said that's going to be in CNN this week. Is that right?
Yeah. So I'm on the opinions, the health section and opinions there, and I'm just wrapping up one for my own blog on kids and their role in this. So I'm hoping I can get that finished in the next couple of days. Every time I sit down to finish it, the data changes, and I'm like, oh, come on. So I want to make sure I get that right before I put it out. But it changes so quickly.
Really, in the medical profession, it's been a real hold on tight, because it was at some point it was almost as if you woke up every day and there was something else new to learn about, and it was quite the white knuckle, hang on tight kind of thing on the roller coaster.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, it was, and that was, I think, what was hard about this is the first pandemic where there was really the information flowing as quickly as it was, and that people everywhere, it didn't matter what walk of life, were being fed information almost in real time as it came out. And so it was landing on this end of the spectrum, it was landing on that end of the spectrum, and it felt like whiplash for a lot of time there with the new information that was coming. It's airborne, it's not airborne, it's masks work, they don't work. But what we've found over time, it's moved and moved. Now it's coalesced around a spot where we know more about the various bits and pieces. So there's not as wild as shifts in information, but there still is certainly, mornings that I wake up and read the new literature that came out and my eyebrow raises. I'm like, oh, okay, this is something different. And it's going to be like that for a while.
Well, I think this, the truth is that, for example, droplet, airborne, asymptomatic, symptomatic spread, there's a little bit of all of those things at various times. And I think that trying to understand what people were trying to say is what's the predominant way that is going to be spread. And I think that, obviously in a setting, if I was doing a procedure in the esophagus, for example, as a cardiologist, there's probably a good chance that there could be airborne spread at that point. And, it's all very different. But, and I think that that's one of the things that, for the public has been hard, is that they've kind of wanted this message that's just, cut and dry. And I think the important thing is to realize that it has to be a little malleable and flexible before we understand this better. And I think we are understanding it better.
We definitely are. And that's it. I mean, I think everybody, and I think that's why, my blog posts have taken off. I mean, we're now up to 24 million people have read them. It's in 15 languages. I think that people were really looking for clear information, even if they wanted to challenge it, because I had people challenging the information quite regularly. And that's part of the process of this. And I don't mind being challenged, just come with facts. I mean, be able to cite what you're saying. And I think that one of the things that we've missed in this outbreak is really clear messaging from even at the state level, but state and federal level, even the world level, like who is jumping around on different issues. We really just wanted clear messaging on what can we do to not so much not get infected, but not to be part of the problem. What things do we need to do as a a person and as a society to not be a statistic in this. And I don't necessarily think that messaging has come as clearly as it should have or as early as it should have. CDC is definitely getting there now. Their 30-page book on kids' activities and sports and schools is a good start, but there's still a lot more to do. And that's what I'm really looking forward to, is getting the, rubber meets the road. What can we do to move forward and just have a clear direction now? So I hope that keeps coming out.
And I think what you said before is so important, is to care about others. Is that, when you walk in, you want to make sure that not just yourself is safe, but other people are safe. And this is one of those instances where it's really about, how do we help other people not get sick, or how do we prevent that from happening? What's our role? And I think that's
community conscience. I keep saying it's community conscience, because the way it works, and we know this, the way it works is a 20-year-old gets sick, they pass it on to a 25-year-old friend. Get infected. Neither of them actually get sick. They pass it on to another friend, and this cryptic transmission that just moves along. Then all of a sudden, that 25-year-old goes to a restaurant or goes to visit grandparents or their parents, and then bring it inside a house. And once it gets inside a house, it goes.
Right.
The attack rate inside houses is much higher because you're in closer contact for a longer period of time. That is made worse when your house is smaller or has more people in it. I mean, if you're sitting there in a 3,000 square foot house with 4 people, you can put an infected person in there, socially distance away, and no one else gets sick. But if you are, living in a house with 3 generations of people, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, how do you have the infected person using a bathroom and do it safely so nobody else does? And so what we see is these disparities of, it really does come with wealth. It comes with, sort of this social equity that's not there, social differences, that we see populations get hit harder when there's more people living in a house or an apartment or in, a group of houses. And that's why it moves through so quickly, because it jumps from a 20 to a 25 to a 32 back to a 25, and then they go home, and then it just hits the whole apartment or the whole building, and then people actually get sick. And that's everybody's role and everybody's job with this. It may not affect you directly, but these transmission chains that jump end up somewhere, and it just needs to hit that sentinel population, an old age home, hit people that are, in a homeless shelter, hit people that live in, urban high density housing. And then it just goes like a wildfire once it hits there.
Yep, absolutely. Any last comments that you'd like to make for this evening?
No, I'd say, this too will end. It's tough, and I realize that I have it a little better than others. I have been able to work from home. Financially, we took a bit of a hit, but it wasn't as bad as other people did because of furloughs and things like that. So I know that there is a big difference between what happens in the community, but this will end. The more we know about it, the more that everybody buys in that this is a community problem, the better off we all will be for this, because we can all get back and do some normalcy. So just because you don't think it's going to affect you in a serious way doesn't mean that you're not part of the problem or you can't be part of the solution. And I just hope that most people buy into being part of the solution.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate the opportunity to chat tonight and have this conversation. Good luck as you transition into the upcoming school year. And, I know that you are in demand, and thank you for doing all this work, because it's important stuff. And your message has been clear and very helpful to many people out there. And thank you for coming on and doing this locally, and have a great night.
You too, Dr. Rocha. Have a great evening. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.